There's a Steve Jobs quote that I love. It goes something like, the moment you realize that the people who made all this stuff were no smarter than you is when you can start actually, changing things. And that is a mindset that's cultivated in people in response to an environment and in iteration with an environment. I think like disempowering environments create disempowered people who have learned to be helpless. You could look at examples of like cars have become a lot harder to understand. You can't really take apart an iPhone. There's like less comprehension possible in our world. And I also think software, because it's not malleable typically, the thoughts of what to change doesn't even occur to us. I don't think about like how should we decorate this podcast meeting room that we're in, because I can't change.
We're just consumers.
We're just consumers. I think the more time you spend in places that cultivate that mindset, the harder it gets to have agency in the world.
Welcome back to Generally Intelligent, a podcast by Imbue on the economic, societal, political, and very human impacts of AI. Today, I'm joined by Geoffrey Litt. Geoffrey is a researcher working on malleable software, computing environments where anyone can adapt their software to meet their needs and their lives. Geoffrey's just joined Notion, and recently he was a researcher at the independent lab Ink and Switch, where he explored the future of computing. He did his PhD at MIT on programming interfaces, and most of his work circles around a very simple but powerful question, which is how can everyday people shape the software they use like clay, so that humans can have more power and agency in the world? And that's a lot of what we'll be exploring in our conversation today. Welcome, Geoffrey. It's really good to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So I'm really curious, actually. We always start with, tell us a bit about how you developed your initial research interests. You went to MIT, you did your PhD in human-computer interfaces. What sparked your interest? What happened, and how did your thinking evolve over time?
Yeah, so way before I got into research, actually, I was just working at a startup shipping product. I worked at an ed tech startup out of college, and that was where this all kind of started. We were a team in Boston shipping software to thousands of schools across the country, and every school is different, right? And from time to time, we would try our best to make the one best report for data that works for every school, whether it's like a rural elementary school or like an urban high school or whatever. And then we would get on these calls, and some teacher or principal would be like, actually, I don't use your product. I just hit export to CSV, and then I use Excel. Right? And it was like, oh no, like it was really sad for me as like a designer or whatever. But then you look at what they did, and it's like, oh man, this is ugly, it's buggy, but it does exactly what you wanted, And sometimes what they would change would be like the tiniest thing. Like, I didn't like that color. That color made our kids feel bad. Or like this word in your product touches a political nerve. Like, it could be tiny, tiny details, but having the people on the ground in the classrooms having the agency to change that stuff was really interesting. This aspect of spreadsheets that just kind of captured me. And so I started thinking, why doesn't more software feel that way? Why is it that, there are some things you can do in Excel, but so much of software feels like it's decided thousands of miles away and you're stuck with however it was decided, And so that sent me down a really, really deep rabbit hole trying to figure that out. And that's how I got into this question.
That's really cool. Yeah, I've heard from someone like Excel is the first and maybe only successful end user programming tool. And like you have all of this interesting use of Excel, but that doesn't work for everything else. So when you were exploring this question, like why isn't all software that way? Where did that lead you? Like why isn't all software that way?
Oh man, yeah. There's a lot of reasons, I think some of them are technical. So I think historically, a lot of people have tried to make programming easier and more accessible. But ultimately, there have been these kind of barriers of needing to think in really abstract ways that are not natural to most people. And so that's been one chunk of the challenge. And I think AI is changing that state of play a lot, and we can talk about that. But there's also a lot of other barriers that are bigger and in some ways harder to tackle. There's economic barriers, like, how do people get paid to make stuff? There's kind of like infrastructural ones, like a lot of our computing environment and ecosystem has kind of calcified around the assumption that people aren't editing their software. If you think about it, right? Like when I send you an Excel spreadsheet and you open it, you're opening it in the editor for the spreadsheet. It's not just a spreadsheet viewer, right? You actually have the editor and you can do whatever you want to it because it's a file that you control. And when we look at a lot of how software is shipped through app stores, the assumption is that, no, like, what are you talking about? The user would never edit the code. In fact, like, we do a lot of things so that they can't edit the code, right? And so I think there's a lot of factors that kind of interlock around this core assumption. And that's part of what I think makes this problem challenging to make progress on, is that you kind of have to address a lot of these together.
That's a really interesting observation, that like Excel is the editor, and like most software is, you open the software, it's only view only. It's not the editor. You maybe can edit the data, but not the UI elements.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest principles around malleability is like, we want to be removing friction and barriers between being a quote unquote user who's passively using something and getting deeper and deeper into actively modding it. A really important point is that I don't think that everyone should be modding software all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a nerd and I don't want to mod most of my software most of the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's just about having the ability to go there if you want. And I think that's where, in an environment like Excel or spreadsheets, having the editor at least available to you always is a key principle. Yeah.
Right. Because sometimes you only want to view the Excel spreadsheet and not change this super complex financial model.
Exactly. And there might be cells that say, don't touch this unless you're really sure you know what you're doing, because you might. And I think that's something that people often miss too, is like, sometimes having more explicit guardrails can actually free people up to feel safer and more creative editing stuff. So if we go back in the history of malleable environments, HyperCard is a system from, I think it started in the 80s, shipped on Macs. And basically, it was kind of like a precursor to PowerPoint in a way. You could kind of make these, they're kind of like slideshows with these index cards, basically. But what was really neat about HyperCard is that you could start up by just drawing pictures or like writing text. And they had these different levels or modes. And level 1 or level 2, I think, was like just editing text and drawing stuff. You weren't even able to code in that level. And then when you wanted to, you could go to level 5, let's say, which was the deepest level where you can do anything. But you're only going there if you know you're ready and you know you want to, And I think in a lot of spreadsheets, you actually have folk practices around this stuff, like, you just mentioned, where maybe you're walling off part of it that's like dangerous to touch or something. And I think sometimes paradoxically, boundaries like that can create freedom for people.
That's super interesting. Kind of like diving into that a little bit, and as part of the infrastructural barriers you were talking about, like, our computing ecosystem, maybe the like infrastructure we have, the UI elements that we have, they're all calcified around this assumption that people are not editing their software. What kind of like infrastructure constraints, different UI components, guardrails, etc., like, do you think could, let's say, like, we rewound back to the 80s, or we're here today, and like we ended up calcifying around a different ecosystem. Like, what elements of that ecosystem might exist such that you end up getting malleable software?
Yeah. So maybe it's best to talk about this concretely. So I can tell you about some experiments we've done at Ink and Switch, where I used to work and do research, and some of the environments that we developed there that we used heavily internally to do our own work that kind of enable the sorts of malleability we were seeking. One system that we developed really deeply was a system called Patchwork. And the core idea of Patchwork was basically, it starts out as just a document editor. Like the flagship feature is just a markdown editor that's collaborative. But then you can go deeper and deeper into modifying it. And what it ends up being is actually an environment where you can make your own tools and share them with people, and edit whatever tools you're using on the fly. Okay, so it kind of achieves some of the goals we wanted. So how do we get that? Well, a few things. You need the ability to live edit your tools as you use them. This is a really important thing we realized is most of the time when I realize I want to change something, I don't have an hour to go do it. I might have like 5 minutes though. And so we found that there's this kind of magical combination of you use AI to do the coding. So that solves how do you get the new code. But then you also have this question of like, how do you ship that to yourself and to your colleagues? And the starting point there is really treat the code of your app just like the documents you're editing together. What I mean by that is, like, when we open a Google Doc together, we're just editing it live, right? Just make your software like that. This is not how people typically think, right? Typically you think, oh, you have to like pushed to GitHub, and there's some like CI pipeline that runs and it deploys, and it's like this industrial process that's arranged around kind of like preventing screw ups and like shipping to millions and millions of people. But like, no, just make it like Google Docs. Okay. Once you do that, you instantly run into a bunch of other problems. So one is, if we're using a piece of software and you're editing it live, it's not going to be fun for me because you're going to be breaking it all the time, right? So then we realized, oh, actually, this is why programmers have Git. We need Git for normal people. So we invested a lot in Patchwork and ideas around version. We call it universal version control. The idea is systems that achieve the goals of programming version control, but for any kind of data and for any kind of user, even someone who's not super nerdy. And so basically, what we found was that when you combine code is just documents that you're sharing with people and you can edit them, you have AI helping you, and you have powerful version control that lets you create copies of things and merge things back together in good ways, then you start getting a really interesting set of ingredients where you can start remixing and mashing up and feeling more playful with your tools and your software. So I think that's one starting point.
That's super interesting. Treating code as a live shared document, like text file between two people, and then having a way to version that, like text and data, I imagine, is kind of the main things that you're versioning.
Those are two things, but actually you
Those
can
are two
version
things.
anything.
What else did you need to version?
So yeah, I mean, Patchwork has whiteboards. Patchwork has spreadsheets. And in fact, because you can add new tools to the system too, actually you end up with kind of the ability to store, like the system needs the ability to store and share arbitrary data, right? This is another thing I'll get into, which is when we think about, okay, what are the barriers to shipping software? A lot of the barriers are that the main ways that we deploy software for people to use assume industrial scale. So you need a backend, you need a database, you need load balancing, blah, 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 nonsense Kubernetes stuff. Like there's a lot of stuff. And, the gap between I have a working prototype that I can run on my computer and I can send you a link and we can collaborate in my new piece of software I made tends to be a lot of work. And so one of our goals in Patchwork was how much of that infrastructure could we offload to the operating system or the environment, so to speak, so that if you have an idea and you vibe code a UI, how can you then share that with me and we're instantly working together in that tool you just made? And there's a lot of layers to kind of figuring out data persistence and sync and all that stuff to make that a reality. I think you're seeing this to some extent in a lot of platform as a service startups out there are trying to figure out how do we become the best backend for vibe coded apps in a sense. And I think that's part of it. But I think we can push even further than most startups are going.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things here, so Imbue recently shipped Sculptor, which is like a tool for you to run parallel agents to write code. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we've been thinking about is kind of like sync and collaboration, real-time collaboration. And something that we made is like this thing called pairing mode. So all of the agents run in containers, which means they don't have your code. They're not running locally. They run in containers because you don't want them to like delete your files accidentally or things like that.
Yeah.
And I actually really resonate with what you said about versioning. Like we've had to think about like the Git workflow of the developer and the agent as two separate things. And how does the agent's version and the developer's version kind of like mesh together? We're just using Git right now, but pairing mode like basically copies the agent's files and rsyncs it to your local environment. And then now you're like real-time editing with the agent. And it's something like what you said is really interesting because we've been thinking about, okay, like I'm real-time editing with the agent, but like actually sometimes I want to real-time edit with someone else. But in the normal existing today software engineering industrial process, like nobody wants to real-time edit with anyone else. That's actually really rare. And so it's been an open question for us, like when do people like in this, we've been thinking a lot about, I resonate with you a lot on like, things built for scale, Kubernetes, like actually wouldn't it be better if everything were local and just running on your, like the compute that you have in your hands and like, you don't have to handle all these scale problems. I'm really curious, when you were working on Patchwork together, when did you want to collaborate real time when coding versus when you want to do this more like industrial, independent two people merging branches into the same main workflow? Did you ever want to do one versus the other? Or did you always want to live edit?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked. I'm fascinated by this area. I think I have this opinion that collaboration between humans and AI is essentially a version control problem.
Oh,
And
that's super interesting.
the lens, what I mean by that is when you think about the problems that a version control system like Git is meant to solve, you have a bunch of people working together. They might be working concurrently on different stuff, and you need ways to go off and try stuff and be experimental. You need ways to review work that other people are coming to you with and talk about, I want to do this. What do you think? Let's go back and forth and discuss. And then you want to track, okay, we decided it's good, let's do it. And you want to see that in your history. And when you think about working with AI, actually, and you look at the needs, a lot of these things map really directly. So um, I have an unreliable alien intelligence out there doing stuff for me. How do I know if I like it? I need some way to review what it did. I need some way to talk with it and with other people about what it's proposing. And then when we like it, we can accept it, right?
We
And
like
so
accept its changes and discard the changes that don't matter.
exactly. And um, I think actually one of the underrated reasons that coding has taken off as a use case for AI actually is the prior existence of mature tooling like pull requests for doing this workflow.
Oh, that's super
And I think in
interesting.
a lot of other domains, if you don't have this stuff built up yet, you can't just let an AI agent go do stuff to a really important, shared workspace without any ability to see what it did, talk with it about what it's proposing. There are ceilings on what you can do there, right? And I think the more version control you have, the more you can just kind of let the agent go do stuff. And so I think it's a fascinating area. Now, to get to your question, I would say when working on Patchwork, we mostly weren't live editing together and coding. We were probably mostly actually working async. But definitely, we were leaning heavily on, yeah, branches. And I think, what you were talking about reminded me of, I think a lot of products are struggling right now to reconcile the old way of Git with the new requirements, you know, parallel agents, like more real-time stuff. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what does it look like do we reinvent version control from scratch for the new requirements? Do we layer on top of Git as a lot of products are doing,
Mm-hmm. One thing that I've been sitting with is kind of on the idea of version control. So, this may be not obvious from our website, but at Imbue, we really care about making software modifiable by the end user because we think that basically it's a question of control as we go into this AI future. Today, we're kind of controlled by our software, actually. Our attention is controlled, our actions are controlled, we're controlled by other people who are building these systems. Sometimes inadvertently, they're trying their best. Sometimes very explicitly, they're trying to maximize profit or engagement. And so AI makes this problem worse. But it also gives us opportunity because AI can write code. And so a question I've been sitting with, kind of to your point about you mostly weren't live editing with Patchwork. You are mostly working async, but you also want to be able to change things, and maybe sometimes those changes make it back in, and maybe sometimes they're just for your local system. In your lived experience, I think it's really rare. Systems like this, except for open source projects, not many systems like this exist. In your lived experience, why did you build live editing if you weren't using it? What was it? I feel like there's something interesting in live editing, and I don't fully understand what it is, and I'm really curious for your thoughts.
Oh man, I think there's three separate topics to unpack there. I'll start with the last one.
Cool.
So, why live editing? I think it's just what people expect. In some sense, it's the most straightforward model. We get on a link, we're looking at the same thing. Every kid expects that now in all of their software. They don't know what files are, they don't know about emailing, it's just everything's live. And I actually think that's a really lovely starting point for remote collaboration. When we get on a whiteboard and we can just draw, it feels really fluid and nice. My view, and I think what we explored largely at Ink and Switch, is um, it's a yes and where you want that, and you want the ability to go off in a corner and think about something privately without having your manager come in and stare at you, right? We call this creative privacy. I did a bunch of user interviews with writers talking about, they feel observed in Google Docs, basically, right? And so I think that's the simple answer, is that live editing is how the world works now. And so we got to meet people where they are. I want to get back to something else you said, though, which is about this question of of values and what software is trying to do to us, essentially. And I think that is a deeper undercurrent of malleability that we haven't really addressed yet. Cory Doctorow has this phrase, adversarial interoperability, which I love. And he talks about things like ad blockers that are browser extensions, right? What's happening there is that there's this adversarial relationship where a website's trying to push ads on you, and you're pushing back and using this technological capability to, basically set up an environment that's more in keeping with the way you want it to be or the way your own values. I think ideas like blue sky algorithms being less centralized are also in this vein. And I think that is a very important part of the equation to consider when we think about barriers. There are incentives that big corporations have to not let us change stuff because that's how their business works, right? One analogy that I sometimes like to use is, it's like a sort of more of a food court than a kitchen. There are these big companies that have their own agendas pushing a menu of choices at you. And in your kitchen, you have a lot more control over what am I trying to do with my food? I don't know, what cuisines do I like? What health criteria am I trying to meet? And you have more of an ability to mold it to be in keeping with your values, So I think of the software app stores as kind of these food courts. So I think that's another big piece we have to solve.
I agree. Yeah, it's really resonant because Glenn on our team, he's like a prototype engineer, and he wrote about how it feels like we're in a world of vending machines right now. We get all these vended products, but in a truly open kitchen, we can change the kitchen layout itself and cook the food that we want. I think the economic. So earlier you talked about three barriers: technical, economic, infrastructure. And we started out talking about infrastructure, but the economic barriers are ones that we think about a lot. I'm curious at Ink and Switch, and I'm happy to talk more about how we think about the economic barriers. But at Ink and Switch, did you think at all about the economic barriers, or kind of what's your perspective on that?
Frankly, we mostly didn't yet, I would say. We were focused on how can we make a really awesome malleable system that we wanted to work in. I think in some ways the economic barriers are some of the hardest ones to work on in a research context, because I think ultimately, companies with commercial incentives have to solve the business model piece. And I think my view of the world is that the technical and infrastructural barriers are big enough that they still really matter, and researchers can make progress on that piece somewhat separately. I don't know. I think the thing that comes to mind for me is I once did a deep dive into this system called OpenDoc, which Apple had in the early mid-90s, which is it's a cousin of a related system at Microsoft called Oli. And the idea was it was very malleable software-esque. It was you could have these mix and match widgets in your documents instead of monolithic applications, and you could kind of buy these smaller widgets from companies and combine them with your existing software. And apparently, one of the challenges they hit was when something breaks, who do you call? A really nice thing about applications is there's a box on your screen. If something's wrong with that box and you have an enterprise support contract, call them, and they're on the hook. And the more you break things down into small units, not only there's basic questions of are you willing to pay for a tiny, tiny feature on its own and have a separate procurement for that, but also who's on the hook for integration work, a lot of users value things working and paying for that. So I think those are some of the big challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that we've been thinking about is this, what LLMs do is they make code easy to write and replicate. In theory, at some point they will. And so to your question of how do we get malleability, but also software that people support? I think there's actually some interesting space between closed source software that people pay for and open source software that is fully volunteer supported. Because kind of the point behind malleable software, one of the requirements is that you need to be able to modify the source code, probably. And so in that sense, malleable software has to be open source by default. or source available by default. But today's open source environment is like free, there's free software. And so like, who's going to support it? Oh, it's like a team of like really overworked developers, and like they're like maintainers of this project, and they're all volunteers, and that sucks. And so I think, so we've been playing with this idea we're calling common source, which is between open source and closed source. And this idea that like, actually probably most of the important software we run should be run from a public commons of code, of common source code. And in common source, what we're toying with is this idea of a license that actually, like, you can get the source code, but you still have to pay the creator or the group of people who are creating the code. And so then that starts to answer some of these questions potentially of like, okay, well, you're paying for maintenance, really. You may be paying a SaaS fee for maintenance and, getting the things you want. Stuff breaks. You can stop paying them. So the incentives are aligned in this way. But at the same time, you still get the source code, so you can make your own changes. And like, if you diverge too far from the original project, well, then, you're maybe they can't help you anymore. But that kind of thing starts to maybe, like, I think we have to make some changes to our assumptions around open source, and the like philosophy behind open source to get to malleable software.
That's a really fascinating idea. I love that. I totally agree that open source seems to be a natural prereq, and then it raises these questions. I think it's tricky because I love that perspective you bring. At the same time, I think like the history of open source business models has been fraught with a lot of failures, and when we think about, okay, code is now much easier to copy. I mean, probably if you have the code, you can easily make a copy that is legally different, so I don't know. It seems tricky. I also think, to your last point around, divergence, I think this is a huge, huge challenge to figure out. If there is an ongoing software project that is shipping updates, and I have my own version of it where I did my own thing, I mean, software developers know this as sort of like the fork maintenance problem, and it can be a huge pain in the ass depending on like what you're doing. There are companies that maintain forks that have teams of engineers just keeping up with what's happening upstream, so to speak. And I think this is something that I've thought a lot about in malleability. I think the root problem is if you treat divergence as kind of like arbitrarily editing the code in any way, the problem of fork maintenance is really hard. Whereas there are other ways to factor it out. Like if you have plugin APIs, you can say, okay, anyone can make a plugin, and we're going to try to like keep this plugin boundary stable is one way to do things. Now, there are trade-offs. Like often there are things you can't do through the plugin API, and so you want to dig deeper, and so I think it does get tricky. But new ways of organizing software to be modular and compositional in different ways can lead to different abilities of people to mod it. And something I'm really curious about is, if we progress towards a world where you have a lot of AI code editing happening and you have people wanting to maintain forks with heavy divergence, maybe we just start structuring our code bases differently to treat that as the number one goal, basically. There have been some wacky research systems that have thought about programming with this as the number one goal, and they get to very different structures than we're used to. Like there's a great idea called behavioral programming from David Hurrell, where basically his idea is, what if a program is like a rule book, just a list of rules, and you just add rules, and rules can cause exceptions to previous rules. So I might say like, the red square can always move to that square, but then you could come along and add a rule that's like, unless that thing says 5. And then you see how like we just keep adding and adding and adding to this ball more and more rules, and we never have to reach into existing rules and modify them. And so, maybe there are ideas like that could change the game.
That's really interesting. So like append only as the solution to divergence.
That's
you
one
like
idea.
actually don't diverge. Yeah, that's interesting. What other ideas are there around divergence?
Another like inspiration, there's a common pattern in software of middlewares where you basically like stack up these layers and you can always add more. I think maybe it's the same principle in the end of just like the more that you can have additive modification without reaching in to touch the existing stuff, the better. I also, frankly, would just throw the AI hammer at it and say, like, to some extent, when you reach in and intrusively modify something, it's going to get messy. But probably 80% of the fixes that happen in fork maintenance are routine and don't require anyone to think that much. They're just icky. And so I'm very optimistic that AI will get to the point where it can mostly automate the easy stuff and then at least only leave the tricky, hard stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So like principally, when it comes to handling divergence, like we really have two options, I think, maybe. Okay, just conjecture, made this up on the spot.
Let's go.
Yeah, so principally we have two options. Like one is maintain, like keep the internals of the system, and then like add more stuff such that the end behavior changes. So like rules create exceptions to previous rules, and like the internals don't change. Or like, you know, middleware or like more layers of abstraction also kind of does the same thing. Like you don't really change the underlying stuff, but you're like adding more abstractions on top. Now you can do different things and more things. Plugins are another similar thing. Like you're not changing the center, but like you've got this API and you can like add stuff. So like one paradigm is like don't change the middle. To like deal with divergence, actually just have like modular pieces on top. And then the second paradigm is like, actually, no, change the middle and then use AI to solve it somehow. So maybe in that paradigm, like something that we do a lot internally with Sculptor is we do test-driven development where we like write a bunch of tests. Mm-hmm. And it's not magical like this yet. Because when we try to write the tests actually don't capture the full behavior of the system. But in theory, you could have tests that capture much of the behavior of the system, kind of like do a full refactor rewrite of the middle, and then like have it abide by some rules. And then that does let you like modify the center.
I like those options. I'll throw in one more complication maybe, which is that once you're talking about collaborating and shared software, I think things get more essentially complicated. I think single player software, you know, whatever, I can have my own weird version and you don't care. As long as I have, you know, a smart enough AI to keep up with updates, it's not your problem. But now imagine we have team software. So now it's fundamentally a different problem where there are compromises that have to be made. People have to have shared practices around working. I'm fascinated by the question of like how far can different people's tooling setups diverge while still retaining the ability to collaborate, and what kind of layering promotes that. So, concrete example: many software engineers have a preferred development environment, and when you join a software team, you get to bring your favorite editor typically, and that works because code is stored in this very universal plain text file format. There's a universal version control layer that most people use, Git. Or whatever, you pick your system. And that's just a file-based thing. So then whatever tools you want to use to edit your files, whether it's Sculptor or like Vim or whatever, not my problem, right? And so there's this really nice abstraction boundary and we can still work together. That, first of all, is not the case for most SaaS software. There's a deep coupling between the data that you're sharing with your teammates and the one editor that is allowed to edit that data. And secondly, I think it's often tricky to even tell, like, where could we draw that boundary? You know, like, could you use like Asana and I use Trello? Would that work? Could we sync them? I don't know. There's probably stuff that doesn't fit, right? At Ink and Switch, we did this project called Cambria, where we kind of took on this challenge at the data layer. So we thought about if you were synchronizing data across really different apps, which want to store their data in different shapes, could you make some sort of glue that shuffles the data back and forth live as people collaborate? So you're always kind of seeing as much as possible on both sides, even if it's not 100%. And so I think there's a lot to consider there too.
That's super interesting. What it makes me think of is, so this is super interesting because on Sculptor, we've been thinking about apps as being separate from data. Like code is not data. And actually data has to be treated fundamentally differently. And with Cambria, you're kind of like synchronizing data across these really different apps. And one thing I'm curious about, you know, this question of like, can I use Asana and you use Trello? Is like, what is universal about data? Like, is a Postgres database that is structured with like infinite columns somewhat universal? Like, is it is it documents that are universal with like plain text, or like, what in all of your experimentation, like what have you learned about data?
This is a fantastic and very difficult question. What is the elemental material that if we just stored everything in X shape, then everything would work?
Uh-huh.
Um, I don't think there's a silver bullet, unfortunately. I do think, though, I think the essential quality to think about is like how structured and specific the data representation is. So, files, for example, are a pretty low level. The idea of files generally is a pretty low level abstraction. It's really just a sequence of bytes. That's all you know. But you can layer ideas on top of that, like file formats, which have their own constraints, right? You can store, like, for example, JSON as a file, which then adds more constraints. But JSON's also pretty general. And then you can say, oh, I have this JSON schema, which says like only JSON of this shape. And I think you can have this progressive, more and more specific layers. And you can't get everyone to agree on really specific schemas. That's never going to happen. At the same time, like really, really low level abstractions, like, it's just a sequence of bytes, good luck, are very open-ended, and I think allow people to do too much different stuff that make it hard to work together. So I think we're aiming for something in the middle. Like, the ink and switch systems all run on this system called AutoMerge, which is a library for synchronizing JSON documents. So, that was like JSON is the universal shape. There are different options. I think like a Postgres database is perfectly reasonable other option. But I think that's roughly the challenge. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I have a bunch of thoughts here. Like, one, it depends on the structure of your data a little bit. Like a Postgres database is good for, data that is stored with like identifiers and attributes of those identifiers. And like JSON blobs are good for a slightly different type of data. What you said makes me wonder, though, if like everything were plain text and people could actually diverge quite a lot. We now have these universal data processors, which are LLMs. And so can we turn that underlying file into like really almost any abstraction along this spectrum of like, from like sequence of bytes to like JSON key values to like JSON with a schema to like database to, something else?
I mean, yeah, I'm super optimistic about that direction of thinking. I think many of the data interrupt problems in the world are just like the same information being represented slightly differently. And for those LLMs, yeah, slam dunk, I think. That said, there are also essential differences. Like, in Cambria, the example we gave is like if one to-do list app can assign multiple people to a task, but another one can only assign one person, there's like nowhere to show it, how like it doesn't work, and maybe then you don't realize that I'm also working on your task, right? So I think there are these tricky essential things to keep in mind when we're working on shared information together with divergent tooling.
Mm. One thing that's interesting about that example is it really separates the kind of like concerns at the data layer versus the UI layer. Like in theory, you could just store whatever data you want. You can store like this, this task having like many, many people assigned to it. And then at the UI layer, you like do, or at the app layer, you like do something, some kind of post-processing to like figure out who you want it to be for your app.
Yeah, but if the app can't show multiple people, then you still don't, I think that
you can't see the underlying data.
Yeah, you can't. And I think maybe you show more of the underlying data, or maybe, I don't know, like an AI comes in and modifies the other to-do app and makes it show multiple people because you just need that. And if the other person doesn't mind, you roll with that. I think, I think it's the essence of it is like when we're collaborating together, we actually have to make compromises about how we're going to do stuff. And there's always going to be like a collective element there that like software can't let us be infinitely individualistic, And I think this actually gets to a broader malleability theme. We talk about this in the essay we published this summer at Ink and Switch around malleable software. Like the goal is not that everyone develops the full skill set needed to do anything to their software. There's a long history of people working together with others. With spreadsheets, for example, there's been some really nice ethnographic research by Bonnie Nardi, who's kind of a legend in the end-user programming research community, looking at, okay, how do people use spreadsheets in offices? And it turns out usually there's someone in the office who's really good at Excel. And when you don't know how to do a complicated formula, you go ask them, right? Um, but you can still do a lot of stuff yourself. And maybe you pick up a bit on what that person did and watch them work, and you level up gradually. Um, and crucially, that person doesn't work at Microsoft. They are in your context. They can sit with you. They know your problems. And so they're much, much closer to the site of use than the site of like original platform production. They call this pattern local developers. And I think this is a really important pattern to think about and build around for these kinds of systems. I mean, we see it at Notion. There's often someone in a company who is really good at Notion and sets stuff up for people, right? I think that layer always exists, and it's not a bad thing that it exists. AI might be able to help fill that role sometimes for some people, but I think assuming that people are working together to create shared software environments should be the goal.
That's really interesting. There's in software development, there's the same thing. Like our CTO, my co-founder Josh, is the expert in a bunch of different ways and helps people figure out how to build on top of the system that we have. And so you need, regardless of how good LLMs are, you probably want some kind of expert. There's still, maybe what you're saying is there's still this idea of levels of expertise with a tool. Even if it's an end user program tool like Excel or programming or Notion, there's levels of expertise, and someone who has a lot of that expertise can actually do a lot of the quote unquote programming and set up the system for other people in their context to modify. So it's not just to our data point, it's not just blob of data and then everyone does their own entire full stack thing on top of this blob of data. It's okay, blob of data, and then different people take it and mold it into what's useful for their own context.
The mental model that I really like there is this idea of a smooth slope from user to creator. So it's not that deep modifications aren't hard. It's that whatever you want to do, you should have to do the least amount of work possible to do that thing. And you can get slowly pulled into deeper stuff if and only if you want to. And you stop where you want to. And I think this is very distinct from our existing computing ecosystem. You can basically use the thing, tweak some settings, and then, if it's an open source project, I guess you could download the entire code base, compile it for 5 hours, learn to code, and it's this insurmountable cliff,
Uh-huh.
And no one's doing that, right?
No.
To some approximation. And so how do we smooth out that cliff is one way to think about it. And I'm curious for your thoughts on, I think AI can help pull people up that cliff if the system is designed correctly. I also think it might actively prevent people from going up the cliff if it's arranged a certain way. And what I mean by that is, if I ask my coworker, who's the Excel wizard, to teach me formulas, and they sit with me for an hour and we do it together and I see them doing stuff and we talk about it, maybe that's a learning moment for me. Whereas if I ask the whatever Excel formula wizard to do it and it spits out something in 5 seconds and it's wrong, but I don't notice, or even if it's right, if it does the thing for me, what did I learn? I actually lost learning them, And so I think a lot about how can we set things up to be closer to that former, but I'm curious how you think about that.
I think this is really one of the key insights about end user programming is that there is a skill curve. There's kind of this learning curve. And you had the gentle slope to tailorability. Yeah, is what you called it. And in LLMs, something that we think about is there are kind of two pieces to tailorability. One is how much the user understands, and then the other is how tailorable the system is. And you can modify both. So modifying how much the user understands is about education in a lot of ways. It's about how do we make it so that it's easy for the user to understand how to go closer to what they're trying to do. A concrete example of us experimenting with this in Sculptor is that there's a beta feature called Suggestions. And it's still very early, but it basically looks at your code base and suggests fixes, improvements, and refactors, directions you can go based on what it looks like you're trying to do. And in theory, the suggestions, like, they're proactive. And so they're kind of telling you things about your code base that you might not know about. And they're telling you things that you might end up learning. So we've had some users who are like, I didn't realize that I shouldn't expose my API key in plain text. Cool. Didn't know that was a security best practice. Or like, I didn't realize that like I had like 5 copies of this function that were slightly different from each other. And actually there was this like better way of doing things that's like the default standard. So that kind of like proactive teaching, I think, could be part of a system that like is an environment, is like an end user programming environment. And like, the ambitious way I think about Sculptor is like, oh, if we could make this into an end user programming environment, that would be awesome. On the system side, like, how do you make the system, like outside of user education, like how do you make the system actually more tailorable? I'm curious for your thoughts here, but I was thinking about interfaces and how some interfaces feel like they might be more amenable to tailorability than others. For example, this might be a terrible example and might not actually satisfy this requirement. I'm going to try it anyway. And I'm curious what you think about like more tailorable interfaces. But for example, like the other day I was using MailChimp and I was trying to send a plain text email and I like could not figure out how to send a plain text email in MailChimp. This is extremely difficult. I was like, man, it would be really nice if I had like a retrieval UI where I could like send some messages in chat and it like finds the API endpoint that is the plain text email, function, and like then gives me a UI that is the plain text email. Like that would be really nice. Then I could like learn like, okay, do you have a plain text email endpoint? And first, and second, if you don't, then maybe that would be an entry point for me to like build one, something like that. So if an app is no navigation, none of this other like none of these other dependencies, it's like retrieval only, like only retrieve API endpoints that take actions. Like maybe that lets me like build more actions on top of the system. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're getting at a really big question, which is like, how are UIs going to evolve in this new age?
Totally.
And I think we might have talked a bit on Twitter about this too, like navigation-free apps or whatever. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, that's right.
So let me get at your question indirectly. So I promise we'll come back to it. So I think command lines are really interesting. We've left them behind for good reasons. GUIs are better in a lot of ways. But there was a really interesting quality that command lines had, which was that when you do stuff manually one time, it's the same way you do it if you want to automate it or build on top of it.
Oh,
and
that's
so while you're
interesting.
doing it, while you're in the course of normal use, you're kind of picking up this underlying structure that ends up being really useful if you ever want to build on top of the thing. Someone had this great phrase, like a CLI is like a mediocre GUI and a mediocre API both, and that's what makes it great, which I think is really lovely.
I love that.
When I think about what you're talking about, I think a big problem with GUIs is that they lack a lot of hooks and compositionality for building on top of and going further with. They kind of tend to like actually not really expose you to like, what are the underlying things I can actually do in the system, and how could I like recompose those in different ways? And so I think that's a big question and challenge for me is, can we retain the benefits of graphical interfaces, things like discoverability, things like data visualization, which I think is like really underused in a lot of LLM interfaces showing us stuff. But can we also figure out how to like make it obvious that you can go further than what this one GUI lets you do and let you in on the internal structure? One concrete starting point could be in a lot of power user apps like Photoshop, when you do stuff, there's an undo stack that shows you everything you've done in a list. So it's reifying actions you're taking as steps. And then that's the building off point for macro recordings and kind of like automations. And I wonder, could we have more computing environments where as you do stuff, you see the things you did as things, and then you go from there?
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Building on that a little bit, something that we think a lot, we work on AI agents, and like agents take actions. And I think there's a difference between like displaying information and taking actions. And the description, actually what you described about like a CLI as a mediocre GUI and a mediocre API is really interesting because CLI tools are primarily for taking actions. They're not very good for displaying information. GUIs are really good for displaying information, and they can be good for discovering actions, but maybe like taking action sometimes, like if you're trying to figure out what action to take, then maybe you can kind of like play around with the information until you figure out what action to take. But the taking of the action in the GUI is not great. It's not very composable. It's like, not very like automatable. And so if we think about like displaying information and taking actions as two separate things, then it makes me wonder, okay, your point about the undo stack is interesting because like that's a sequence of actions which could be turned into a CLI tool in theory. And the question really is like, okay, what's the input into the CLI tool? Unfortunately, sometimes the input involves like looking at a bunch of data and analyzing it and like visualizing it in like in a GUI form, or something like that. But there's some processing that goes into like the input, but the action itself can be a CLI tool.
Yeah, totally. And I think now I write most of my CLI commands by just telling an AI what I want to do, and then it writes some really long command that I don't fully understand.
Totally.
And I hit enter, right? Which I probably should pay more attention to. But I think you're really getting at something.
Seems to work.
It usually works, right? There's no problem
works.
there.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
I think like we are all figuring out what interaction models make sense right now. And I think you're getting at a couple important things, which is that for commands and actions, I think like language is actually really good for saying what to do for the most part. And then for the return path from the agent, I think for some things, maybe two-way voice conversation feels good, but for a lot of things, having visual aids helps. And so deploying the full field of graphic design and data viz to show things. Like when you ask Siri for the weather and it shows you a weather card, this is like a version of this loop, right? So I think that's a really powerful basic loop. And then the one thing I want beyond that for some use cases is a shared locus of attention, like a desk we can both point at and work on. So that might be as simple as, telling the agent, edit this code in Sculptor, right? Or conversely, like the agent saying like, hey, did you notice that this line is weird? You're kind of sharing this thing.
Yeah, you have like a shared space you're both looking at.
And you can point at. And I think like that combination, I think, ends up being pretty good.
Interesting. An idea we've been toying with is that agent-human collaboration and human-human collaboration might not be such different things. Like perhaps you can design for both of them. And like one of the principles in Sculptor, one of the like design principles is everything you can see, the agent should also be able to see. It should like understand how it works. It should see your entire UI. If you tell it something and you're referencing a part of the UI that's not the chat, like it should know what you're talking about. And same with like human-human collaboration. To your point earlier about like real time is just what people expect. Like I think maybe like two humans want to both be looking at the same surface and the same information. Otherwise, it's actually quite hard to communicate.
I really like that principle you just brought up. I think to a large extent, aiming for human-human collaboration as a gold standard for a lot of stuff is actually a great goal. I think there are other patterns that can make sense sometimes, but even just looking at human-human, like if you and I are sitting next to each other pair programming, there's a lot going on. So, very simple stuff like you can point at things and see my screen, and I know that you can see my screen, and there's not any weird question of what can you see. So there's a lot of good theory of mind going on. But also I think there's much deeper stuff. So something I've been thinking about lately, and I'm curious your thoughts on, is you can tell if I'm really busy and stressed because we have a launch tomorrow, and I just want this freaking button to work, and I'm like, hey, Kanjun, can you fix this button for me, please? You're not going to launch into like an hour-long lecture about like the philosophy of like how we think about buttons, right? Like you're just going to like help me out because I'm in a bind. And it might be a totally different situation. Like it might be my first day at a new job, and I'm like, man, like I've never used this programming language before. Can you like show me around a bit? And I've always felt like computers by defaulting to having so little context about us and our environment compared to these human interactions, are at a real disadvantage, um, where they don't they can't sense these things, and so they rely on us to give them that context through our prompting in the AI era, but we're not very good at giving them all the context that they need, and so we end up in these weird mismatches. And um, particularly along that dimension, as I just brought up, like, how do you know how much to bring the person along and help them learn themselves versus just do it for them? When when should they be brought along? When does it matter? I don't even know myself, and I'm as a programmer, I'm often very unsure how much I should be getting in the details of the thing. Um, Even if the AI can do it perfectly, there's some intangible benefit to me being in the details. When I'm UI prototyping, for example, I might have new, different ideas from knowing how it works, for example. And so I don't even trust myself to know how much I should be in the details. How do we do this?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question and direction. Like when people talk about AI slop, like AI slop is this kind of like lack of taste in a way. And like what you're pointing at that's really interesting is like the more you understand how something works, how your system works, how what you're trying to build, the UI you're trying to build works, the more kind of like taste you have for where it can go. And like there's this kind of like taste comes from depth and like a depth of understanding of me as the human. That and like it's so weird because like AI systems have no taste, and yet they know everything. So it's not about knowing the thing. It's something about like preferential attention based on the details that we're seeing that like serve what we're trying to get at or something. I'm like quite confused about this topic.
I think a lot of people have a very incorrect mental model of how creative work happens, which
Yeah.
is something like there's an idea in your head, you just got to somehow like get it into the world as
Uh-huh.
it is in your head. And if you could just do that, then it's done. And so in that model, like all you need to do, quote unquote, is like describe the idea perfectly. And then something else can just go do it. Right. But
Right.
I
That's
think
not
like
how it works.
that's not how it works. And
Not at all.
um, creative work, open-ended work, like anyone who's really deep in it knows that there's this conversation happening between you and some medium that you work in, where the idea is being shaped as you go. Working with the medium is changing your conception of what you want. There might even be like accidents that happen that are cool, spark new ideas. And to some extent, maybe some of it's even muscle memory, right? So it's possible, for example, that like a guitarist composing a new song might not know what chords they're about to play. Their fingers just do something, and then they hear it and they're like, "Oh, that's cool," right? So when you when you start digging into that, I think it raises a lot of questions about the role of AI in that process. And I think a lot about this in my own creative practice, which is mostly professionally UI prototyping. Like I use AI coding a lot, and I think at its best, it can really speed up feedback loops that weren't essential for me to be in, and that lets me make progress faster in this exploration. At worst, it cuts off a whole um, process that I would have been in myself of creative exploration, because I say what I want and it makes one bad thing, and I'm like, oh man, like that's not good, but like you made the whole thing and now I can't unsee it. And so I
Do you
think,
really feel that?
yeah, totally.
That's really
That's
interesting.
happened to me, and it's because I'm like, oh well, it's done and it's terrible, so like whatever. And I think it's a very sensitive, like I'm an AI coding optimist in the sense that I think it can be a huge accelerant. I use it a lot, but I think we have to be very clear-eyed about like we're all changing our creative media, and that's going to do something to our creative practice. And I think the people who are worried about especially AI art are totally onto something there.
Hmm. This is really interesting. The like thing that I'm afraid to say when I talk about Imbue or AI agents is like I think of us as kind of like trying to upend the like economic system in a way, and the like kind of something about the way that things are working, because fundamentally like AI systems and AI agents are a source of power, and they become that source of power by basically being the way thinking happens. And so what you just said is like, oh, the system thought for me, and now I have this thought. But like, I didn't have the intermediary thoughts before I got to this thought. And because I didn't have those intermediary thoughts, I couldn't get to a different thought. I only got to the end thought. So
Yes,
like,
this is very concerning to me.
This is quite concerning. I'm curious, after you got the end thought, if you went back to the intermediary thoughts, like, okay, you got this bad UI from your LLM. Can you go back to the intermediary things and like try to understand it better? And like, or can you truly not unsee it? Is there some property, like, I'm curious about your personal experience here.
Yeah. I would say that for me, it's a very emotional process. So it's not just like a logical thing. There's like an excitement factor, a momentum factor, like, oh yeah, like we're getting somewhere factor. And again, the tricky thing is that AI often really helps with this. Like it preserves momentum and avoids roadblocks that would have killed the vibe, So like it's great when it works, I think. But when it doesn't, yeah, and it it's not really about literally being able to unsee it. It's that it changes my emotional relationship to the process in a way that makes me not as excited about doing it anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah,
maybe what happened is like it came out with a bad idea and it killed your momentum. And you're like, I thought that there was something interesting here, but I guess not.
exactly.
Oh, maybe I'll move on to something else.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'll never know what if I had done it myself. Would I have come up with something? And in fact, even when it comes to, in some ways, when it comes up with something good, it's even worse. Because sometimes I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. Like I have a few little tweaks, but good job. And then I'm like, wait, what would I have done? Like, would I have done something better? I don't know. And I'm not going to spend the time to figure out anymore. So, I think one like mental model I try to use is there are kind of things that I care more and less about that I see as more and less core to like who I am or what I work on. And so the less core it is to me, like some disposable secondary tool or something that I wouldn't have built without AI in the first place, I'm okay just like being very free with it. But then the closer it gets to like my core practice, I feel like more of a urgency to like be really critically reflecting on what's going on and kind of not going too far. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels sometimes to me, I resonate with this a lot. I tried using like GPT 4.5 for writing, and 4.5 was like the first model that was actually quite good at writing. And for like a month, I was like really happy. I was like, oh my God, my writing process is amazing. Like I'm getting so many more ideas through it, like all in flow. There's no writer's block. And then I like zoomed out for a week, stopped working on the piece I was working on. I came back and I was like, wow, this is like not me at all.
Wow.
And I like rewrote the whole thing. No LLMs. And the really interesting like reflection, like I feel like there are almost kind of like thought shelling points. And because these systems are distributions, they actually produce the like thought shelling points that are highest likelihood. And because they're high likelihood, like, and they're shelling points, like you kind of like just end up there and it's like really hard to get out of them.
They're tempting.
And
they pull you in.
They're really tempting. Yeah, they pull you in. Exactly. And so now you kind of like end up in this like weird groove. And it's really actually hard to get out of it and be creative, like takes stepping away.
Yeah. I mean, another manifestation of this that I'm curious about with Sculptor is I've been playing with parallel coding agents a bit and finding them really interesting. I'm still learning how to use them. Something I found recently, I went like overboard for a day. So I was like, oh my God, like this is amazing. I had 2 projects I was working on and I had to pick one to work on for the day. And I was like, you know what? I can do both. And so all day I was just kind of flip-flopping between these 2 projects. And, it kind of worked. But I felt really off at the end of the day. And what I realized was, man, like, I'm not sure that I did great work on either, because actually, even with perfect implementers doing stuff on both projects, it's not like AI coding quality challenge. It's like a my mental bandwidth challenge. Like if I'm really creatively leading these things, I can't multitask actually. And
No.
so there's a different bottleneck, which is me and my brain.
Yes.
And I think like I've been trying to reflect on, okay, so what do I do with that? Maybe I only parallelize within the same project or on the same area. Maybe I have one main thing I'm thinking about, and then I have armies of bots doing all the maintenance and bug fixing and stuff I don't have time for. I don't know, but I'm curious your thoughts.
Oh, that's super interesting because, yeah, I always recommend never work on two projects at the same time if you're trying to do something creative with these agents, with these like parallel agents. It's interesting because like I resonate with you what you're saying a lot. Like I think when you're doing something creative or researchy with software, maybe at least for me, like what I'm trying to do is explore the space and evolve my thinking and understanding of the problem as I'm building.
Yeah.
That's like a very abstract, yeah. But I'm evolving my understanding of the problem of what I'm trying to do. And so with parallel agents, like, I don't know, in Sculptor, one thing we're trying to optimize for is divergence instead of convergence. So recently we shipped a feature. This is in beta right now. You can turn it on in the settings called forking. You can fork an agent. And so now you can you had this agent build a UI. You didn't like the UI. Go back to where you started and be like, try something totally different. Like try this instead. And then try also this. And it'll like snapshot your agent's current state, all the context, and like fork it into a bunch of different tasks. And one thing I really like about this, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Keep going.
Okay, cool. Yeah. One thing I really like about this is it kind of gets me out of this groove we were just talking about. Like, there are many ways to end up in that groove. One way to end up in that groove is I've built up some context. I like went down this path. I'm like maybe debugging some minor detail. Now I'm really annoyed because like all of this debugging context is in the context. And I need to like get it back somehow. And like,
yeah.
I'm like in this weird groove. Another way to get into a weird groove is it had a bad idea and now I can't get it out. Like I can't get back to the place where it could have generated good ideas. And so yeah, the forking thing is really about like, how do I help the user get out of grooves so that they can do really divergent thinking and divergent things and not have to like try to like wrestle with the agent to get the agent out of these grooves.
I love that idea. I'm a huge fan of that way of thinking. And it's funny, it's coming back to version control actually. Like these questions of like, how do you structure divergent work and like even see it and how do you encourage it is really, it's like a tooling problem, I think. Yeah, I mean, something I've wondered about is also having more structure to the divergence. So what I mean by that is not just like try 3 random things, but let's say I'm like, I want a to-do app. What if an agent said, okay, so one thing you could have the agent do is give you a big questionnaire, right? Like, should it be really simple or really complicated? Like, should it be for work or for personal life? Like, and you just go through and answer like these 10 questions or whatever. And I think that's that's like the current state of the art, I would say, in like specification is answering a bunch of questions, and it's fine, but it's pretty tedious. And it's also, I think, not how real design processes often work best. Often the way things work best is by looking at a few and saying like, I like that one, and then talking about why, So something I've thought about is, once the tokens are like free, can you just generate like 100 to-do apps? But not randomly. So the agent would first think about, okay, like what are the dimensions that the user might care about? Let's set up a design space along those, 3, 5, 8 dimensions, whatever. Let's take some guesses on what they might want and maybe pick a bunch of dense app points in that space around there. And then let's also try some wildcards, really crazy options. Pre-generate 100 apps. And then when we come back to the user, we're like, okay, let's just start a conversation. Let's show you some options. Oh, you want it to be more X? We have that ready already, And it sort of would be more like jamming with like a design consultancy, except the feedback loop is like in seconds and not weeks, But like more playing with options.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. Like there are LLM tools out there, or like when you ask deep research to go do some research, the first thing it'll do is like ask you some questions about the query that you asked. And whenever it asks me these questions, my answer to all of the questions is like yes to all.
Yeah.
The questions are useless. And
Yeah.
I was reflecting on like, why are these questions useless? Well, it's because it's not actually questions I want to answer. It's more, I want to see some output and be like, nah, I didn't like this part. I want more of this. Like what we want is for the LLM to like help us like understand the problem better. This goes back to what you and I were just saying about like the creative process is about understanding the problem space, what we're trying to solve for, what we're trying to do better as we go, and like to be able to create and like move in that direction easily through the medium.
Yeah. I mean, I think like, and part of this, I love that you're thinking about encouraging this in the tool, because I totally agree with you that often, even if it's technically possible to do this somehow, once you're in the groove, it kind of you feel stuck unless it's easy.
Exactly.
There's a couple beautiful systems out there that play with ideas of spatial canvases as ways to visualize that branching. So like in not just like LLM chats, but also like creative media. There's a system I love called Spellburst. My friend Tyler Engert and some folks at Stanford worked on it. Where it's a spatial canvas, and you make these little like art sketches, and then you can hit a button that makes a bunch of forks off from that one, and you basically try a bunch of things, and then you're like, oh, I like that one, and then let's diverge from there, right? And so you can kind of like explore, but you see all the variations spreading out in this tree, and I think that sort of thinking can be very generative.
That's super interesting. Yeah, we've struggled to figure out how to represent forking, like forked agents. And I don't know if a canvas works when it's not so visual. Like you can't really visualize code very well. Like, I want to see at a glance kind of where each fork is going, but it's really hard to do that with code. I'm curious when you've thought about malleable software and kind of like helping the user not only like make changes, but like, this goes back to the question of like what kind of infrastructure, technical infrastructure, like allows the user to actually explore. Like, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this.
It's a fascinating question. I agree with you that inherently visual media are a much more obvious fit for like a visual canvas or something. What you're getting at really is, how do you give the right feel for what a piece of code is, in a concise visual way? And I think like one dimension that I'm always thinking about is it's really hard to tell from looking at code how solid it is. This is a big problem in Malleable software we found in Patchwork, because when a company ships a piece of software in the App Store, there's like a minimum bar it's hitting, right? You hope. That might not be true anymore with LLMs, honestly. But so if someone's charging money for it, it should be at a certain quality bar. If I just made a tool for myself and I vibe coded it in 5 minutes and it works for me, what do you make of that? Like, do you want to use it? Like, it depends. Probably you wouldn't want to just wholesale adopt it for something really important. You might be okay playing with it, but it's hard to tell often from the outside which one it is. And is this thing even maintained? I think people look at like GitHub stars and commit histories, for example, as like these sorts of signals
Proxies.
of life. Yeah, right. And I think if we have way more software and it can be produced way more readily by people who don't know what they're doing, there's going to be more bad software out there, which is not necessarily a problem. There's a lot of bad spreadsheets out there, and it's fine. But I think you need to be able to tell. I kind of wish you could see like, an analogy like is this like a balsa wood model of a bridge, or is this like the Golden Gate freaking bridge? Like in physical media, it's really, really obvious, and you could never get confused. But with software, it's not as clear. And could we make that clearer somehow?
This is really interesting. One of the prototypes we've been playing around with in Sculptor is this idea of a report card for your code. So can we give you, I think it's actually having worked on it, it's a really hard problem to answer. What goes into the report card? How do you know if a piece of code is robust? Depending on what you want to do with it, like you might want it to be robust in different ways. Maybe you want it to be more extensible, or maybe you want it to be like really well tested. To your question of like, if I'm in this world of malleable software, there's a lot of forking, there's a lot of divergence. Like, how do I know where to build from? Like, what is safe to build from? What are the proxies for that?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good question.
I'll throw another idea at you, which is I wonder, like one of my beliefs around divergence and versioning is that there's a lot of meta work around the work that humans find tedious, like writing pull request descriptions. And getting a pull request that has a really, really good description is much easier to review, but it's a lot of work to produce that. I think AIs, we should be pushing much harder than we are to produce amazing review experiences and artifacts. It's the kind of thing, we should be the most spoiled managers in the world, where like our reports are coming to us with like they've spent like weeks preparing this presentation about this tiny bug fix that doesn't really matter. Is the feeling we can have. Like we can spend the virtual time for them to do that. And whether that's, coming up with like, maybe, yeah, if it makes 100 to-do apps for me, maybe it should make like a 3D world where I can like browse the different apps and see how they're different from one another. Maybe it's just like a really, really good deck that like walks me through them and explains the differences as like a PDF. I don't know. Like if we gave like a high school or college intern the task of explaining these 100 apps, what would they do? I don't know, but I think we can get extremely creative. There's one project I love called QuickPose. I think it's called that, by Eric Ron, where like they did versioning on a spatial canvas, but it was more like a whiteboard that you got to draw on and arrange the versions yourself, freeform. So they found that artists would use it. I think they did some tests with artists, and it would be like a cluster of versions over in this corner is like the ones that had this intriguing property. And then there was this offshoot over there that was really weird. And then this is like our mainline exploration, and you can like actually arrange them and label them and describe them yourself. So imagine like if the AI's diversion, could it like make a poster for you of what it tried and how it all fits together?
That's super interesting. Two really interesting things in that. One is like the malleability of this canvas where artists could arrange the versions themselves is in itself a kind of like malleable software property where like you want the end user to be able to like explore by like arranging the explorations and kind of like reasoning and thinking through them. So that's really interesting. The other thing that you said that I thought was really interesting is this like idea that we're really under focused on presenting results from the AI. Like the LLM just dumps a bunch of text at you. Why has it not thought about how to present it as a slideshow or as like as a better presentation? That's really weird.
It's wild. I mean, I also think, so I think this is going to become much, much more important very rapidly because there's one argument you could make, which is like, oh, the AIs are going to get so good we don't need to review. But I think that's totally false. Because what I've observed in coding is they get better, so I give them harder stuff. And in fact, it's almost the opposite problem where I'm giving them more and more stuff that's more and more important, that review becomes, and they're going off and doing stuff that I'm not even in the details on anymore. So the review step becomes more and more critical over time. And I think it's headed towards a world where most of my time is reviewing. So really like the quality of that review experience, whatever it is, to let me quickly, happily, and like correctly tell, is this good and what do I want to change? I think that's like the whole ballgame, for interfaces for using these things.
I think that's really interesting, and I really agree. And I would actually, a way I've been thinking about it in my mind is like switching from the term review, which is part of this like industrial process of software, as you said earlier. I love that term. Switching from the idea of this as review to the idea of this as like being part of the medium of working with coding agents or AI agents. Like review is part of a powerful medium for agents because the medium doesn't really work without this step of understanding what is going on and where to steer it next. And as you said, like, yeah, the more we use it, the like more critical things we give it, and the more important this piece of the medium is, it feels like.
Yeah, I guess I love that reframe. I think like you could think of it two ways, right? One is a human to human analogy of like we're jamming, and like it's not like a quality assurance step. It's more like we're working together. I wouldn't like frame, like if you brought me some work and we were working on something, I wouldn't feel okay, like time to like check if you did what I said. It'd be like, we're riffing, right? So maybe that's one way to think about it. But another is like, I wonder if we could, something about the ideas we were talking about are visualizing had me thinking about non-human interactions. So like if a potter is forming a piece of clay into a pot, they're not like reviewing suggested pots, there's just a loop going where like the clay is becoming something and like they're reacting live and there's a loop going. And I almost wonder if could we get to the point where crafting software feels that way, where there's some representation you're working with that feels like you can just directly touch it. Um, but it's not a language interaction. You more see it coming together, and you're like, yeah,
It's
you're crafting
tactile.
it into a pot. Yeah, and I think that's very, very obviously possible for shallow UI design. So like, I should be able to move UI elements around. I shouldn't be telling a model like, please move that box 3 pixels. That's ridiculous, and that hopefully will get solved. Although our civilization has taken backwards progress on that since the 90s, so we'll see. But the harder question is like, what is that for logic? I don't know.
This is like the thing I want most. How do we turn software into clay? I don't know. Yeah, what do you think about that for logic? This is kind of like gets at Brett Victor dynamic land, like how do we tactily feel what's happening in software?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think actually, well, since you mentioned Brett, I think Brett has this great essay, the Up and Down the Ladder of Abstraction, which I think has a lot to say about how do you see this map of a very complex space and navigate through it to find the place you want to be in that map. I think that's a really beautiful idea that could be brought to what's my map of my 100 to-do apps, and how do I find the one that I want? Going up into very abstract line and then jumping down into like demoing concrete ones. Another inspiration that I think about a lot is Michael Nielsen's work on it's like AIA. I forget. I guess it's like artificial intelligence augmentation. I think is yeah, where I think he and Sean Carter had this piece of like
this like slider that you would
these
drag.
sliders which are changing very deep conceptual attributes of a font, a typeface, that an AI I think learned. Probably like with an unsupervised
Like
learning
a deep
algorithm or
learning
something. Yeah.
algorithm,
And basically like, I think it was pretty simple. Like you were moving in latent space of fonts with a slider, and that that does make me wonder, what is the equivalent of that for code? Like, could you do like some of the Anthropic steering vector stuff on CodeGen, and then like you choose the steering vector, and if you make the app like, is there like a complicated slider that you can just drag and the app gets more complicated or simpler, or I don't know.
It's really interesting. It makes me think about like, okay, if you combine the slider idea and the abstraction ladder idea, like you kind of like drag the slider up and down the levels of abstraction. You can like modify at each level of abstraction, and then like the full abstraction ladder is regenerated for the new app. And now you can like move down or up again. And like, so you're like moving in whatever, like at whatever level you want. So like, okay, I want to actually like totally change this to-do app in order to be this way, versus like, I want to change this like tiny function in this to-do app to like do this slightly different thing instead.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a very ambitious vision we're sketching out here.
I know.
But yeah, I think this is a very different path than the one that the industry's on right now, which is mostly just a bunch of natural language in the groove chats.
Yes. I'm curious, looking back at the research that you've done and where you are now, what insights do you feel like maybe overlooked right now? Or like, what kinds of things do you think people are not paying attention to that they should pay more attention to get the future that is more empowering, agentic, free?
I would come back to the infrastructure piece of malleability. So I think that people are, obviously everyone's excited about AI making professional software development more productive. And I think some people are excited about personal tooling around AI building software for us. But I think people haven't realized how much the existing ecosystem is not prepared to support that. And when you think about the most basic questions, like if I wanted to add a feature to Airbnb, what would I do? Or and like people like, wait, what? Like that doesn't even,
It can't even compute that.
Yeah, like I wrote this little like kind of tongue-in-cheek story essay thing where um, it was a conversation. It was like a imaginary conversation with this like mysterious wizard, and the mysterious wizard says, I want to schedule a weekly seminar. So it's on my calendar, and I just want to like figure out how many attendees there are and order the right number of pizzas for them automatically by Uber Eats. And this apprentice person is like, oh, like I'll just vibe code a new app that does it. And then the wizard's like, oh no, like can you add the button to Uber Eats, please? And the apprentice's brain is like, I can't add that button. What are you talking about? So I think there's just like this really like deep change of perspective that hasn't fully been internalized. When you bring the cost of editing code down by as much as it's coming down, what makes sense to build around that is just not on people's radar, I think.
Yeah, what do you think? If you could list out every piece of infrastructure, this is awesome because it's something that we're thinking about. Like a way I think about Imbue is we want to build the public infrastructure that's necessary for malleable personal software. So what is that? And so if you had a wish list, what's on the wish list?
I think it's a lot of what we talked about. I mean, it's like so many of the ideas. It's all software ships with the editor for that software. It's all software is live modifiable locally. The live modifications can be instantly live shared with your collaborators, but there's awesome version control, so you can diverge and converge as needed. You have really awesome data infrastructure that's really easy for random individuals to run and doesn't require like corporate scale, and enables modern collaborative apps. I think like a lot of those elements you could imagine coming together in essentially some sort of new operating system or platform. And I think over time, I expect that the pressure towards personal software will be strong enough that we'll start to see this emerge in some form. But I don't know quite how.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting because like when we were building Sculptor, one of the things that we're thinking about is like, oh, what if the software you're building ships with some Sculptor environment so that the end user can edit it and like see the live edits in real time and share the code base with someone and something like that. It's not quite there. I'm not quite sure how to do it because the version control problem is really hard. And like something about this, like we're not quite there yet. The data versioning problem is also really hard.
I mean, I think who pays for the AI edits that are going to happen from the users? Like currently AI code
user
editing.
pays.
AI code editing is economically viable because a lot of people doing it a lot are making software that ships to millions of people so they can get paid a lot to do it. How does that work? I mean, I think there's a lot of questions.
For the infrastructure piece of malleability, is there anything in terms of like cultural norms or the way that we think about software or the like way that like people exist or communities exist that like you think either are changing or need to change as we go into this future?
I'm really glad you asked that. This is actually one of the reasons I care most about malleable software. It has less to do with software and more to do with how people feel about their relationship to the world. There's a Steve Jobs quote that I love. It goes something like, the moment you realize that the people who made all this stuff were no smarter than you is when you can start actually, changing things.
Everything around you can be changed.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really powerful mindset. And that is a mindset that's cultivated in people in response to an environment and in iteration with an environment. I think like disempowering environments create disempowered people who have learned to be helpless. And I think there's like a general trend where, narrowly, like you could look at examples of like cars have become a lot harder to understand. You can't really take apart an iPhone. There's like less comprehension possible in our world. And I also think software, because it's not malleable typically, the more time we spend in digital environments, the more time we spend in these places that we think of as prefab corporate environments, and we don't even, the thoughts of what to change doesn't even occur to us. I don't think about like, how should we decorate this podcast meeting room that we're in, because I can't change, and
we're just consumers.
I think the more time you spend in places that cultivate that mindset, the harder it gets to have agency in the world. And so I think, and there's a double risk here, which is that with AI, I think some of the conversations we've had around being in the details and understanding things, if there's less of a need to even understand things to minimally get through your life. Um, I think it ties into this general trend of there's a revealed preference towards convenience. And we all, myself included, choose it often. But that can have long term consequences both for ourselves individually and as a society. And so I do think it's one way we can work on this, I think, is make software a place where people can exercise their will more and they're encouraged to do that. And I think that's maybe one way to stem this tide a bit and may perhaps even start a virtuous spiral where kids come to feel that they can do anything and they will be right because they can.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I resonate with that a lot. Like, our digital worlds right now are disempowering environments. We are kind of at the mercy of them in a lot of ways. We can't really change them very well. We don't have that much agency. And because we spend so much of our lives digitally, like, that ends up we end up feeling disempowered in our lives. And so it feels like as we go into and in a world with AI agents, like, this can get worse. Like, these are agents run by other people with their incentives that are now taking actions on our behalf. And so it's even more disempowering, some of the things that we talked about. And so it's like the core cultural shift is, how do we rekindle the original idea of the personal computer, the original dream of like these systems as like manifestors of our will and what we want in our lives.
Exactly. And I think that's a great closing note in a way to bring up that the original vision of, people like Douglas Engelbart and Alan Kay. Their original vision was the personal computer is precisely this empowering thing. That's why it's personal. And so I think if we can find ways to get back to that, the world will be a better place.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I think it's possible. I think we're at this turning point right now where software can become personal, and we do need these pieces of infrastructure that make it possible. And like, we could change the economics incentives around it because now everything is so replicable. And so we're at a good time. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Yeah. And I mean, I just joined Notion, but Notion's one of the players trying to make it happen, right? Like, build that platform. I think it's not going to be one winner. I think there's going to be many platforms that enable this philosophy of personal software in so many different arenas. So yeah, I'm excited. Let's do it.
I agree. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Geoffrey. This was really fun and a great meandering dive into all of these different ideas. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.